Dawn broke cold over the sodden fields of Stirlingshire on June 24, 1314. Mist rose from the Bannockburn stream, where water ran red between steep banks choked with the bodies of armored men. On the ridge above, Robert Bruce stood among his Scottish spearmen, watching the greatest army England had ever sent into Scotland disintegrate into chaos. 15,000 English soldiers, knights in plate armor worth a king's ransom, Welsh longbowmen whose arrows had broken French cavalry at Crécy, infantry drawn from every shire south of the border, were fleeing in disorder toward a stream they could not cross. The mud swallowed horses whole. Knights drowned in water barely waist-deep, dragged down by 60 pounds of steel. Behind them, Scottish pikemen advanced in tight formations called schiltrons, forests of 12-foot spears that no cavalry could penetrate, moving with a discipline that should not have been possible for an army assembled in months. The battle had begun the previous afternoon when Edward II's vanguard encountered Bruce's position south of Stirling Castle. What followed was textbook medieval warfare, armored knights charging uphill into prepared defenses, their horses stumbling into concealed pits, their lances shattering against Scottish spears. But something else had happened that second day, something that chroniclers struggled to explain. As the English lines began to buckle, as Edward's cavalry found itself trapped between Scottish infantry and the treacherous ground of the Carse, a fresh force appeared. Accounts speak of horsemen charging the English flank at the critical moment, mounted warriors whose sudden appearance caused the English to break entirely. The Vita Edwardi Secundi, written within years of the battle, notes with puzzlement that reinforcements arrived when Bruce needed them most, though it cannot say who they were. Scottish sources mention them only in passing, as if reluctant to draw attention to their presence. English chroniclers, humiliated by the defeat, provide contradictory descriptions. Some call them camp followers. Others suggest fresh troops from the Highlands. The mystery deepens when we examine what happened next. Bruce, who had spent 8 years fighting a guerrilla war against overwhelming English power, suddenly possessed an army capable of meeting England's finest in open battle. His tactics at Bannockburn displayed sophistication unusual for a kingdom that had been ravaged by war for a generation. The coordinated movement of the schiltrons, the precise timing of the cavalry charge that scattered the English archers, the use of terrain to neutralize England's numerical advantage. These were not the improvisations of a desperate rebel, but the calculated maneuvers of a commander who had studied European warfare at its highest level. Within weeks of the battle, Bruce's government began issuing documents with seals bearing symbols that had not appeared in Scotland before: geometric patterns, architectural references, coded imagery that spoke to those who knew how to read it. Churches built in the years following Bannockburn incorporated design elements unprecedented in Scottish architecture, their proportions too precise to be accidental, their orientations aligned with astronomical events that medieval masons should not have understood. And in the Western Highlands, in a remote valley called Kilmartin, stonemasons began carving grave markers unlike anything Scotland had seen. Simple slabs of stone, marked only with the outline of a straight sword. No names, no clan symbols, no inscriptions, just the weapon, carved to exact scale, the blade pointing toward Jerusalem. These graves appeared suddenly, in the years between 1310 and 1320, in a region far from the main theaters of Bruce's wars. The men buried beneath those stones had died honored, their graves tended, their memory preserved, but their identities deliberately concealed. 700 years later, those anonymous graves remain the only physical evidence of what may have happened in the autumn of 1307, when the most powerful military order in Christendom was destroyed in a single night, and its surviving knights vanished into history. The Battle of Bannockburn did not begin on that misty June morning in 1314. It began 7 years earlier, on Friday the 13th of October, when King Philip IV of France signed arrest warrants that would scatter the Knights Templar across Europe, sending some into hiding, some to torture chambers, and some, perhaps, to a kingdom beyond the reach of papal authority, where an excommunicated king needed every sword he could find. To understand the mystery of Bannockburn, we must first understand what the Knights Templar had become by the autumn of 1307. Founded in Jerusalem around 1119 by 9 French knights who claimed their mission was protecting pilgrims, the Order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon had evolved into something unprecedented in medieval Europe. They answered only to the Pope, operated across all borders with diplomatic immunity, and controlled a financial network that functioned as the world's first international banking system. A merchant could deposit gold with the Templars in London and withdraw it in Jerusalem using encrypted letters of credit that only Templar officials could verify. Kings borrowed from them to finance wars. The French crown had accumulated debts to the temple so massive that destroying the order became more practical than repaying it. By 1307, the Templars owned more than 9,000 properties across Europe, commanderies, fortresses, farms, ports, entire towns. Their Paris temple housed reserves that rivaled the treasury of France itself, but it was not merely wealth that made them dangerous. The Templars had spent 2 centuries in the East, their knights serving in the Crusader kingdoms, their officers negotiating with Muslim rulers, their scholars collecting texts from Byzantine libraries and Arab universities. They had excavated beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem during their first decade, before they accepted new members or conducted visible operations. What they found there, if anything, remains unknown. But they emerged, transformed, suddenly granted privileges no other organization possessed. Modern archaeology has confirmed extensive tunneling beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, tunnels that match medieval descriptions of Templar excavations. British surveyors in the 1860s recovered Templar artifacts from these passages: spurs, sword fragments, evidence of sustained underground activity. The knights had been searching for something. Whether they found it is a question that has never been answered, but their rapid ascent to power suggests they possessed leverage that secular and religious authorities found impossible to resist. Some historians point to the order's documented contacts with Islamic mystical traditions, their patronage of scholars who translated Arabic scientific texts into Latin, their architectural innovations that appeared suddenly in Templar churches after 1128. Others note the strange charges that would eventually be brought against them, accusations not merely of heresy, but of possessing secret knowledge, conducting initiation rituals that involved mysterious heads or relics, maintaining doctrines hidden from Rome itself. Scotland's involvement with the Templars began early and ran deep. When Hugh de Payens, the order's founder, traveled to Europe in 1128 to recruit members and secure recognition from the Church, he made the unusual decision to journey as far north as Scotland, meeting personally with King David the Circe. David granted the Templars extensive lands in Midlothian and elsewhere, establishing the preceptory at Ballintrodoch, later renamed Temple, as their Scottish headquarters. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars administered estates, collected revenues, trained knights, and integrated themselves into Scotland's military and ecclesiastical structures. Their preceptories stretched from the borders to Aberdeenshire, positioned along strategic routes and defensive positions. The order's relationship with Scottish noble families was intimate. The Sinclairs, the Seatons, the Campbells maintained documented connections to Templar networks. When the crisis came in 1307, these families would face a choice between obeying papal authority or protecting men they had known for generations. The choice they made would be written not in chronicles, but in stone and silence, in the unmarked graves and sudden architectural innovations that appeared across Scotland in the years following the suppression. Understanding this context is essential, because what happened at Bannockburn cannot be separated from what happened 7 years earlier, when the most powerful military order in Europe was destroyed in a coordinated strike that should have been impossible to escape, but which left hundreds of knights unaccounted for, their fates unknown, their destinations never recorded in any surviving document. The breakthrough came not from a single dramatic excavation, but from the slow accumulation of evidence that historians had dismissed as coincidental for generations. In 2016, during routine maintenance of the churchyard wall at Temple in Midlothian, the site once known as Ballintrodoch, principal seat of the Knights Templar in Scotland, construction workers uncovered 2 carved stone slabs buried in the foundations. Archaeological teams from Edinburgh were immediately summoned. The stones displayed characteristics consistent with 12th or 13th century funerary monuments, but they had been deliberately removed from their original contexts and repurposed into a later structure. Their inscriptions and symbolism had been rendered invisible through incorporation into the wall, suggesting someone in a later era considered them too sensitive to remain visible but too significant to destroy entirely. Radiocarbon dating of organic material found with the stones returned results placing them between 1280 and 1340, precisely the period spanning the Templar suppression and the Battle of Bannockburn. The iconographic elements, when finally cleaned and documented, included crosses of a specific design known from Templar contexts in France and the Holy Land, along with geometric patterns that appeared nowhere else in medieval Scottish architecture of that era. But Temple was only one site. Across Scotland, archaeological surveys using modern technology began revealing patterns that had been invisible to earlier generations. Ground-penetrating radar at former Templar properties identified building foundations beneath existing structures, foundations that did not match later architectural phases and which carbon dating consistently placed in the early 14th century, exactly when the order was officially extinct. At Marycoulter in Aberdeenshire, excavations uncovered timbers from fortifications built using construction techniques documented at Templar castles in the Crusader states, but unknown in Scotland before 1300. Soil analysis revealed signatures consistent with intensive habitation during the period 1310–1320, despite official records claiming the property stood abandoned after papal dissolution of the order. The archaeological record was telling a story that written sources had concealed. Templar sites in Scotland had not been abandoned after 1312, but had continued active use by individuals with specific military and architectural expertise. Most striking was the discovery at Kilmartin, a remote valley in Argyll where the parish church graveyard contains approximately 80 medieval carved grave slabs. Among these are a distinctive subset: simple stones marked only with the outline of a straight sword, no names, no heraldic devices, no clan affiliations. Modern paleographic analysis of the carving techniques dates these anonymous graves to between 1300 and 1320. The swords depicted are single-handed weapons of a specific type, their dimensions carved with precision that allows identification of the blade style. They match exactly the weapons documented in Templar military inventories from the late 13th century, swords that were standard issue for the order's knights but uncommon among Scottish warriors of the period. The graves share another characteristic. They employ burial orientations unusual for Scottish Christian practice, but consistent with traditions documented at Templar cemeteries in France, Portugal, and the Holy Land. Comparative studies conducted by researchers from multiple institutions found that these graves displayed the same characteristics as confirmed Templar burial sites: invariably simple, austere, devoid of decoration, frequently marked by the straight sword, and always anonymous. The pattern was too specific to be accidental. Someone with authority in Argyll in the years immediately following the Templar suppression had ordered the burial of warriors whose identities could not be revealed, but whose graves required marking according to traditions that had no place in 14th century Scotland, unless the traditions had been brought by men who could not afford to have their true allegiances recorded. In 2020, a separate discovery added another dimension to the puzzle. 2 church bells in Dumfriesshire, which had hung in their tower for 900 years, were conclusively identified through forensic metallurgy and paleographic analysis as having been sponsored by a 12th century knight with documented connections to the early Templar presence in southwestern Scotland. Victorian-era misinterpretation had obscured the bell's origins, but modern imaging revealed Latin inscriptions and heraldic symbols linking them to the Knights Templar. The bells had been cast in workshops known to have served the order, using bronze alloys that matched samples from Templar sites in France. More significantly, the bells had been moved from their original location at a convent with Templar connections and rehung at a parish church after 1312, suggesting someone had taken deliberate action to preserve artifacts associated with the suppressed order by disguising their origins. Each of these discoveries taken alone proves nothing, but assembled together, they form a pattern. Physical evidence of Templar presence in Scotland continuing well beyond the date when the order officially ceased to exist, concentrated in regions associated with Robert the Bruce's military operations, and coinciding precisely with the period when Bruce's forces displayed military capabilities they should not have possessed. The archaeological record suggests not merely that Templars reached Scotland, but that they were integrated into Scottish military structures under circumstances that required their origins to remain concealed. A concealment so successful, it has endured for 7 centuries, preserved only in anonymous graves and symbols carved into stone by hands that dared not sign their work. Reconstructing what actually happened requires assembling fragments from sources that were never meant to be connected, and recognizing that the absence of documentation can itself be evidence when that absence follows a suspicious pattern. The critical date is October 13, 1307, a Friday that would enter European consciousness as the original Friday the 13th, forever associated with treachery and misfortune. On that morning, royal agents across France simultaneously arrested approximately 15,000 individuals associated with the Knights Templar, from the Grand Master Jacques de Molay in the Paris Temple to sergeants at remote rural commanderies. The operation was coordinated with precision that required months of planning. Sealed letters had been distributed to royal officials weeks earlier with instructions to open them only on October 12th, giving one night to prepare for dawn arrests. King Philip IV needed surprise because the Templars, if warned, had the resources and connections to disappear. But someone did warn them. Trial testimony from captured Templars repeatedly references unusual activity in September 1307. Meetings held in secret, documents removed from archives, assets quietly transferred. A sergeant named Jean de Chalon testified under torture in 1308 that he had heard Gerard de Villiers, preceptor of France, had fled Paris before the arrests with 50 horses carrying an unknown cargo. Chalon claimed that 18 galleys had departed the Templar naval base at La Rochelle under Templar command, their holds laden with the whole treasury, destination unrecorded. Port records from La Rochelle show unusual activity in late September and early October 1307, ships departing with no listed passengers or cargo, harbor fees paid in advance for vessels that never returned. Statistical analysis conducted by researchers in recent decades suggests that of approximately 2,000 Templars estimated to have been in France when the arrests were ordered, at least 335 are unaccounted for in subsequent trial records, execution documents, or transfers to other religious orders. They were not captured, not tried, not pensioned off, and left no death records in France. Where did they go? Only 2 regions of Christian Europe offered viable refuge in 1307: Portugal, where King Denis III would refuse to persecute the order and eventually reconstitute the Templars as the Order of Christ, and Scotland, where King Robert the Bruce stood excommunicated by the same pope who had ordered the Templar suppression. Bruce had been excommunicated in 1306 for the murder of John Comyn at the altar of Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, an act that placed him and his kingdom outside the formal structures of Christian authority. Papal edicts carried no weight in a kingdom already condemned by Rome. When Pope Clement V issued the bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae in November 1307, commanding all Christian monarchs to arrest Templars and seize their property, Scotland was in no position to comply even if Bruce had been inclined to do so. Maritime historians note that autumn Atlantic crossings were hazardous but not impossible for experienced sailors with good ships, which the Templars certainly possessed. From La Rochelle, the prevailing winds and currents would carry vessels north toward Brittany, then west past Ireland and up Scotland's western coast. The voyage would take weeks under favorable conditions, longer if weather-forced delays. Landfall along Scotland's west coast would place refugees in Argyll, precisely where the anonymous sword-carved graves at Kilmartin later appeared. But documentary sources provide almost no direct confirmation. In England, where Templar arrests began in January 1308, trial records are extensive despite being largely inconclusive. In France, inquisitorial documents provide horrifying detail about interrogations and executions. In Scotland, there is near total silence. Only 2 Scottish Templars, Walter de Clifton, Grand Preceptor of Scotland, and William de Middleton, appeared before a papal inquisition at Holyrood in 1309. The others had vanished. Some historians have interpreted this absence as evidence that Scottish Templars simply fled or died, leaving no trace, but examination of Scottish monastic cartularies reveals something more deliberate. Missing folios covering precisely the years 1307 to 1320, pages cut from bindings with precision rather than lost to age or decay. Royal Exchequer rolls for Robert the Bruce's reign are incomplete for the same period, showing gaps where property transactions involving former Templar estates should have been recorded. Church registers for several Scottish dioceses, including St. Andrews, have sections obliterated, text scraped away using pumice or blade, passages overwritten, dates modified. These are not random losses, but targeted removals. Someone, at multiple points across centuries, systematically removed references to what happened to the Templars in Scotland. The pattern suggests that Bruce protected the refugees, but that the evidence of this protection had to be concealed to avoid diplomatic consequences once Scotland sought legitimacy within the wider European community. The timeline becomes clearer when we examine Bruce's military capabilities before and after 1307. Between 1306 and 1307, Bruce fought a guerrilla war of raids and ambushes, avoiding open battle with English forces. He possessed perhaps 3,000 poorly equipped fighters, mostly infantry with limited training. Then, in the years between 1307 and 1314, something changed. His army acquired discipline, his commanders demonstrated tactical sophistication, his forces began conducting siege operations that required engineering expertise Scotland's ravaged kingdom should not have possessed. By June 1314, Bruce commanded an army capable of meeting England's finest in pitched battle and destroying them through coordinated maneuvers that required months of training to execute properly. Where did this capability come from? The Templars had been the premier military force of Christian Europe for 2 centuries. Their officers trained in warfare conducted against the Mamluks and Saracens. Their organizational systems refined through decades of campaign logistics. If even 2 or 3 dozen experienced Templar commanders had offered their services to Bruce, the impact on Scottish military effectiveness would have been transformative, but only if their presence remained concealed, which would explain why no contemporary chronicle explicitly names them. The systematic erasure becomes most apparent when comparing Scottish sources with records from other regions that dealt with Templar refugees. In Portugal, King Denis the Friern conducted his own investigation of the Templars in 1308, declared them innocent of heresy, and by 1319 had negotiated with Pope John XXIII to create the Order of Christ, which inherited all Templar properties and personnel in Portugal. The transition was documented bureaucratically, with charters recording property transfers, papal bulls authorizing the new order, and membership rolls listing knights who had been Templars and now served under a different name. In Aragon, King James II refused to use torture during Templar interrogations and found no evidence of heresy. His archives contain extensive correspondence about how to handle former Templars and their assets. In England, Edward II's administration left detailed trial records, even though the proceedings were largely inconclusive and many English Templars were eventually pensioned off rather than punished. But in Scotland, there is nothing comparable. Official records indicate only that former Templar properties were nominally transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, as mandated by papal decree. Yet these transfers appear to have been largely on paper. The properties continued to be called by their Templar names: the Temple in Midlothian, Temple lands in references spanning centuries, and archaeological evidence shows continuous occupation and modification during precisely the period when they should have stood empty or under new management. The gaps in the documentary record follow patterns that suggest deliberate editing. Monastic cartularies from abbeys with known Templar connections show physical evidence of page removal, surviving stub edges where parchment was cut from bindings, sequences of dates that skip over 1307-1320 entirely, marginal notes that reference passages which no longer exist. At Melrose Abbey, which had extensive dealings with both the Templars and Robert the Bruce, the cartulary's entries for the crucial years are missing. At Holyrood, where the 1309 Papal Inquisition of Scottish Templars occurred, the official record of that Inquisition is fragmentary, with sections describing what happened to Templars who did not appear before the court mysteriously absent. French and English inquisitors kept detailed records of who was arrested, who confessed, who recanted, who was executed, and who was transferred to other religious orders. The Scottish Inquisition record, by contrast, notes only that 2 Templars appeared, with no explanation of what happened to the rest of the Scottish Brotherhood. This is not the absence of information through loss over time. It is the absence of information that should have been created at the time but apparently was not, or was created and subsequently destroyed. Royal records present similar anomalies. The Scottish Exchequer rolls, which documented crown revenues and expenditures, should show consistent entries for former Templar properties that officially became crown or hospitaller holdings. Instead, there are gaps, properties that generated income in 1300 and again in 1330, show no entries for the intervening decades, suggesting revenue was being collected, but not officially recorded. Why would the crown fail to document income from valuable estates? The most plausible explanation is that the properties were being used for purposes that could not be officially acknowledged, such as housing military personnel whose presence in Scotland violated agreements Bruce would later make with the papacy. The ecclesiastical records are perhaps the most revealing in their silences. Bishops' registers, which recorded ordinations, ecclesiastical appointments, and disciplinary matters, show gaps in several Scottish dioceses during the crucial period. Paleographic analysis of surviving sections reveals signs of alteration. Passages scraped away, text overwritten, dates modified. In one instance discovered during conservation work, ultraviolet imaging revealed traces of text beneath a deliberately applied wash of ink. The faint words included Fratres Templi, Brothers of the Temple, before the passage was obscured. The censorship appears to have occurred at multiple historical moments, some immediately after 1307, by ecclesiastical authorities seeking to demonstrate compliance with papal directives while actually protecting refugees, others in the 15th and 16th centuries when Scotland was seeking legitimacy within wider Christendom and could not afford to be seen as a haven for condemned heretics, and still others during the Reformation, when Protestant reformers purged monastic libraries without, always distinguishing between religious content and historical records. Each layer of censorship compounded the others, creating absences within absences. What remains is a documentary landscape where the absence of information speaks as loudly as any chronicle. Something happened in Scotland involving the Knights Templar between 1307 and 1320, something significant enough that multiple generations felt compelled to conceal it. The concealment was so systematic that only by comparing the Scottish record with those of other kingdoms, and by examining physical traces in the landscape and archaeology, can the outlines of what was hidden begin to emerge from 7 centuries of silence. When we map the divergent historical accounts geographically, patterns emerge that illuminate what official histories obscure. French sources, dominated by inquisitorial proceedings, portray the Templars as defeated heretics whose order was righteously destroyed. The density of documentation is overwhelming. Hundreds of arrest records, torture protocols, execution accounts, property seizures covering every region where the order operated. Modern historians have compiled databases documenting the fates of individual Templars, arrested at Paris Temple, interrogated at Carcassonne, burned at Sens, transferred to Cistercian custody at Pontoise. The French record is comprehensive precisely because the persecution was total. King Philip IV needed meticulous documentation to justify his actions before skeptical observers, and the Inquisition kept obsessive records as a matter of institutional procedure. But even in France, anomalies appear. Maritime records from Templar-controlled ports show unexplained activity in September and early October 1307, weeks before the arrests. Ships departed La Rochelle with no listed cargo or passengers. Harbor fees paid for vessels that never returned to French waters. Testimony from a Templar sergeant mentions wagon trains moving south from Paris toward the Pyrenees before the arrests, carrying metal-bound chests that were never recovered. The French sources are complete in documenting the destruction, but they implicitly acknowledge that significant assets and personnel escaped before the net closed. English chronicles present a different perspective. When Edward II finally moved against the Templars in January 1308, months after Philip's initial strikes, the English arrests were less systematic, the trials less brutal, and the outcomes more varied. Many English Templars were pensioned off and lived out their days peacefully in monasteries. Trial records note repeatedly that torture was not extensively used, and consequently few confessions were obtained. English chroniclers like Walter of Gisborough mention rumors that Templars fled to Scotland, but provide no details, perhaps because they had none, or perhaps because acknowledging a Templar refuge in Scotland would grant legitimacy to Bruce's rebellious regime. The English accounts preserve a negative space, an acknowledgement that something happened beyond their borders that they could not fully describe. Crucially, a letter from Edward II to his sheriffs, preserved in the National Archives, orders seizure of Templar properties in our realm, explicitly noting that properties in Scotland were beyond his authority since Robert the Bruce controlled that kingdom. English power did not extend north of the border, and English chroniclers, hostile to Bruce, had no interest in helping Scottish propaganda by confirming that Scotland harbored heretical refugees. The silence in English sources about Scottish Templars is thus politically motivated, a choice not to acknowledge what they suspected but could not prove. Scottish sources present the greatest challenge because they are the most thoroughly redacted. What survives are primarily property records showing nominal transfers of former Templar estates to the Knights Hospitaller, as papal decree required. But these transfers were often in name only. Place names preserve memory that official documents suppress. Sites continued to be called the Temple in local usage for centuries after the Hospitaller administration supposedly began. Linguistic evidence shows that communities distinguished between Temple lands, former Templar holdings, and hospital lands, properties that had always belonged to the Hospitallers, suggesting popular memory recognized that the Templar properties had a different status even after official transfer. Architectural analysis provides another layer of divergent evidence. Several former Templar properties in Scotland underwent significant modification in the early 14th century. New fortifications, expanded chapels, residential quarters built in styles consistent with military orders. If the properties were truly abandoned after 1312, and then gradually absorbed by the Hospitallers, why the sudden construction activity? The most economical explanation is that the properties continued to function under continuous management, but that the managers' identities could not be officially recorded. Comparative architectural studies identify specific design elements appearing at Scottish sites after 1307 that match techniques documented at Templar fortifications in the Crusader states. Construction methods that were sophisticated for the period and were not used in Scotland before 1300, but which appear suddenly at multiple locations between 1310 and 1320. Someone with specialized training in Templar military architecture was directing these projects. The divergent accounts begin to converge when viewed not as contradictory, but as complementary perspectives on a complex event. French sources document the destruction of the order within French territory. English sources document the exclusion of Scotland from that destruction through acknowledgement of Bruce's de facto independence. Scottish sources document absorption and transformation through a combination of nominal compliance with papal directives, properties transferred to Hospitallers, and actual practice, properties continuing to function in their original capacity. Together, they map a process by which an international military order, officially dissolved, continued to exist in fragmented form across Europe, destroyed in France, driven underground in England, and reconstituted under new identities in places like Portugal and Scotland where political circumstances permitted. Scotland was not an anomaly but part of a larger pattern. The Templars did not simply vanish in 1307-1312, but transformed, their institutional identity destroyed while their personnel, expertise, and traditions survived in regions where local authorities chose protection over persecution. The physical evidence confirms this interpretation. The graves at Kilmartin, the modified fortifications at Temple and Mary Coulter, the architectural innovations that appeared in Scottish churches after 1310, the systematic documentary redaction that concealed these developments for centuries, all point to the same conclusion. The Knights Templar reached Scotland, were integrated into Bruce's military apparatus and continued to function under Scottish protection, leaving traces in stone and landscape that official chronicles could not entirely erase. The mystery of Bannockburn is not whether Templars were present, but how many came, what roles they played, and why their participation required such comprehensive concealment that only archaeology can now reveal what written sources deliberately hid. The suppression of the Knights Templar was not merely about wealth or political power, but about knowledge, specifically about controlling who possessed certain forms of military, financial, and possibly esoteric expertise that challenged established authority. What made the order dangerous to secular rulers was not only their treasure, but their institutional memory, accumulated over 2 centuries of operation across continents. The Templars maintained extensive archives at their Paris headquarters and regional commanderies, including diplomatic correspondence that documented secret negotiations and compromising information about kings and popes, financial records showing who owed what to whom across Europe, maps of the Holy Land and Mediterranean trade routes that were strategic military assets, and ritual texts governing their internal practices and initiation ceremonies. When Philip IV's agents seized the Paris temple in October 1307, Securing these archives was a primary objective. Royal inventories list confiscated documents, but they also note significant gaps, records that should have existed but were not found, suggesting preemptive removal. The question of what knowledge required suppression becomes clearer when examining the charges brought against the Templars. Beyond financial accusations and standard heresy allegations, the Inquisitors focused obsessively on questions about secret initiation rites, mysterious relics or heads that the order supposedly venerated, and claims that Templars possessed texts or traditions that contradicted Orthodox Christianity. Under torture, various knights described different objects. Some called it a head, others a wooden idol, some claimed it was silver, others said it was bearded. The contradiction suggests the confessions were fabricated or coerced, but the persistence of accusations about hidden knowledge indicates this was what the Inquisitors feared most. Not that the Templars had committed heresy, but that they possessed alternative traditions outside church control. Modern analysis of the charges reveals they were calculated to ensure no Christian monarch could defend the order. Accusations of denying Christ and spitting on the cross would horrify any medieval audience. But embedded within the sensational allegations were more specific claims. That Templars maintained contact with Muslim scholars, that they collected Arabic scientific texts, that their architectural innovations came from knowledge that should not have existed in Christian Europe. The order's documented patronage of scholars who translated works from Arabic to Latin, their known relationships with Sufi mystics documented by Muslim chroniclers, and the sudden appearance of geometric and astronomical sophistication in Templar churches after their return from Jerusalem all suggest they had indeed acquired expertise that challenged the church's monopoly on legitimate knowledge. Whether this knowledge was mystical, scientific, or simply practical matters less than the fact that it was outside ecclesiastical control, making the Templars dangerous not because of what they knew specifically, but because they demonstrated that alternative sources of truth existed beyond Rome's authority. In Scotland, the question of forbidden knowledge takes on different dimensions because the refugees would have brought archives with them. If Gerard de Villiers fled Paris with 50 horses carrying an unknown cargo, and if 18 galleys departed La Rochelle with the whole treasury, some of what was transported must have been documentary rather than bullion. Gold is heavy but compact. 50 horses could carry immense wealth in coin. But Templar administrative culture was text-based. They were meticulous record keepers, who documented everything through encrypted correspondence. If the goal was merely to escape with wealth, fleeing commanders would have converted assets to portable form. The fact that testimony specifically mentions chests and cargo being loaded over multiple days suggests they were preserving something bulkier than gold. Manuscripts, ledgers, ritual texts, maps, architectural drawings, and possibly relics whose value was symbolic rather than monetary. No collection of Templar documents has ever been discovered in Scotland, yet the transmission of specific knowledge is evident in what appeared there afterward. Rosslyn Chapel, built in the 15th century by William Sinclair, whose family had documented Templar connections, contains carvings that scholars have linked to Templar, Masonic, and esoteric traditions. The chapel's designer possessed architectural knowledge and symbolic vocabularies that should not have been available in 15th century Scotland, unless that knowledge had been preserved and transmitted secretly across generations. The chapel functions as encoded text, its carvings a library written in stone for those with eyes to read it. Similarly, the geographic distribution of post-suppression architectural innovations reveals patterns suggesting organized preservation of tradition. Sites across southern Scotland display carved stones and architectural elements from the early 14th century, onward employing consistent symbolic vocabularies that cannot be explained by independent development or coincidental convergence. This is evidence of shared knowledge maintained across generations outside official channels. The Templars had developed over their 2 centuries of existence, not merely military and financial expertise, but an entire system of knowledge transmission through symbolic language, architectural proportion, and ritual practice. This system allowed them to encode information in forms that could persist even when the organization that created them was destroyed. When the order was suppressed, the knowledge did not vanish. It went underground, preserved by individuals and families who maintained the traditions while abandoning the explicit Templar identity that had become fatal. In Scotland, where Bruce provided protection, this preservation could occur more openly than elsewhere. though still with sufficient discretion to avoid diplomatic consequences. The result was a hidden current in Scottish culture, influencing military organization, architectural tradition, and eventually the development of Scottish Freemasonry, which emerged in the 17th century claiming Templar heritage and employing rituals and symbols that suggest genuine transmission of tradition, even if direct institutional continuity cannot be proven. The conspiracy was not that the Templars were heretics. Modern scholarship has thoroughly debunked those charges, but that they represented an alternative locus of knowledge outside the control of church and crown, and that some of them survived to pass that knowledge forward, creating a tradition that would influence European intellectual development for centuries in ways we are only beginning to map. What they knew may have been less important than the fact that they knew it independently, demonstrating that truth could exist beyond the institutions that claimed to monopolize it. The survival of Templar traditions in Scotland required transformation, a process of adaptation that allowed knowledge and expertise to persist, while the organizational identity that made them dangerous was abandoned. Men who had worn white mantles emblazoned with red crosses could not continue doing so without inviting the persecution they had fled, even in a kingdom beyond immediate papal authority. The archaeological and architectural evidence traces their integration into Scottish structures through a geographic network aligned with Bruce's military needs and political power base. Former Templar properties were concentrated in southern and eastern Scotland, positioned along the primary invasion routes from England and near strategic strongholds Bruce needed to control. At Temple in Midlothian, barely 10 miles south of Edinburgh, the former Templar preceptory commanded approaches to Scotland's capital. At Mary Coulter in Aberdeenshire, Templar holdings secured northern routes. In the borders, multiple Templar commanderies formed a defensive network that Bruce would need to hold against English incursions. If Bruce absorbed Templar refugees into his military infrastructure, these locations would have been ideal positions for experienced officers who could train troops, organize logistics, and oversee fortification of strategic sites. The archaeological record confirms unusual activity at these sites during the period 1310 and 1320. Construction of defensive structures, using techniques documented at Templar castles in the Crusader states, modifications to existing buildings that required engineering expertise Scotland should not have possessed, and occupation patterns inconsistent with the abandoned state the properties should have displayed after papal dissolution of the order. Maritime connections provide another vector for Templar integration. The order had maintained a fleet based at La Rochelle, and evidence suggests ships reached Scotland's west coast in late 1307 or early 1308. Argyll and the Western Isles offered harbors accessible to vessels crossing from France, in a region dominated by maritime culture where Norse, Irish, and Scottish influences overlapped. Kilmartin, with its collection of enigmatic sword-carved graves, lies in Argyll, barely 15 miles from the Sound of Jura, ideal landfall for ships arriving from the south. The graves date to 1300 to 1320, precisely when Templar refugees would have been arriving and dying. The carved swords match Templar weapons. The burial traditions reflect Templar practice, and the anonymity suggests these were men whose identities could not be revealed but whose service required honorable burial. The concentration of such graves in Argyll, rather than in regions closer to Edinburgh or the borders, suggests that initial landing and integration occurred in the west, with personnel subsequently distributed to locations across Bruce's territories as needed. Sir Neil Campbell, who held authority in Argyll from 1296 onward, was Bruce's brother-in-law and one of his most trusted commanders. If anyone in Scotland would have been positioned to receive Templar refugees and integrate them into Bruce's forces, it was Campbell, operating in a region where his authority was absolute and royal oversight minimal. Trade routes and monastic networks facilitated the diffusion of Templar traditions across subsequent generations. Scottish monasteries maintained connections with continental houses, exchanging not only correspondence but also monks, manuscripts, and material culture. Several Scottish abbeys were affiliated with Cistercian or Augustinian orders that had maintained close relationships with the Templars before the suppression. When Templar refugees entered religious life under different identities, they brought architectural knowledge, manuscript illumination techniques, and symbolic vocabularies they had developed. This explains the appearance of distinctively Templar motifs in churches and monasteries built decades after the order's dissolution. The knowledge moved through networks that functioned semi-independently of royal and ecclesiastical bureaucracies, transmitted by craftsmen, scribes, and clergy whose work preserved traditions that official policy sought to erase. The 15th century saw the emergence of institutions that claimed Templar heritage explicitly. Rosslyn Chapel, begun in 1446 by William Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, is the most famous example. The Sinclair family's documented connections to the Templars before 1307, combined with oral traditions claiming they sheltered refugees, suggest the chapel represents conscious preservation of Templar symbolic vocabulary. Whether this is authentic transmission or Renaissance-era Romanticism remains debated, but the chapel demonstrates that by the mid-15th century, Templar identity had transformed from dangerous liability to something worth claiming publicly, suggesting the order's reputation had shifted in Scottish cultural memory from heretical to heroic. Freemasonry's emergence in Scotland provides another possible vector for tradition survival. The earliest documented Masonic lodges appeared in Scotland in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, though Masonic historians argue their traditions are older. Several Scottish lodges claimed Templar descent, and rituals incorporated narratives about the order's suppression and secret survival. While direct institutional continuity from Templars to Freemasons cannot be proven, the symbolic overlap is extensive. Both organizations used architectural metaphors, emphasized moral instruction through allegorical ritual, maintained hierarchical degrees of initiation, and employed symbols, the square, compass, and temple, common to both traditions. If Templar knowledge survived in Scotland, craft guilds and proto-Masonic organizations operating semi-publicly, but with internal traditions kept from outsiders would have been logical repositories. The transformation from military religious order to dispersed initiatory tradition represents successful adaptation. The Templars died as an institution in 1312, but their ideas, symbols, and traditions survived by spreading through multiple channels, leaving no clear institutional trail but imprinting their patterns on organizations that continue today, carrying forward echoes of an order that officially died 7 centuries ago, but whose influence proved impossible to extinguish. The geographic distribution reveals a network stretching from Argyll landing sites to Edinburgh fortifications to border defensive positions, all showing evidence of Templar-trained personnel during the crucial decade between 1307 and 1317. This was not random refuge but organized integration, suggesting Bruce deliberately recruited the military expertise fleeing Europe, provided protection in exchange for service, and then worked systematically to conceal that collaboration once Scotland began seeking diplomatic rehabilitation within Christian Europe. The strategy succeeded so completely that only archaeology and comparative analysis of architectural traditions can now reveal what written sources were deliberately made to obscure. The breakthrough in understanding came not from a single dramatic discovery, but from the cumulative application of interdisciplinary methodologies to evidence that had been visible but uninterpreted for generations. Statistical analysis provided the first systematic framework. Researchers compiled comprehensive databases of Templar personnel documented across Europe before 1307, cross-referenced these with arrest records, execution documents, transfers to other orders, and death records maintained by various authorities. The analysis identified at least 335 Templars who should have been captured in the initial French arrests but are unaccounted for in subsequent documentation. They did not appear in trials, were not pensioned off, did not transfer to the Hospitallers, and left no death records. Statistical modeling of escape routes, based on known Templar holdings, maritime capabilities, and the geography of regions where persecution was less intense, identified Scotland as among the most probable destinations. Further modeling of the military demographics required for the Battle of Bannockburn, particularly the appearance of trained cavalry capable of executing the decisive flank charge, suggested that incorporating between 29 and 48 experienced Templar knights and sergeants into Bruce's forces would have been strategically significant. The numbers aligned too precisely to be coincidental. Archaeological excavation provided physical corroboration of this theoretical framework. At Temple in Midlothian, ground-penetrating radar surveys revealed building foundations beneath and around the existing church that predate documented Hospitaller occupation, but post-date the original Templar preceptory. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from these structures returned dates between 1310 and 1340, precisely the period when official records claim no Templar activity occurred. The architectural layout matches design principles documented at Templar commanderies in France and the Holy Land, including specific orientations, proportional relationships between structures, and defensive features characteristic of military religious architecture. These were not local builders copying generic monastic layouts, but professionals applying specialized knowledge of Templar tradition. At Kilmartin, paleographers examining the carved gravestones identified specific letter forms and symbolic elements traceable to Templar contexts. Advanced imaging techniques revealed traces of deliberately damaged inscriptions beneath surface weathering. Reconstructed fragments include phrases in Latin using formulae documented in Templar liturgical texts. The inscriptions were not worn away by time but deliberately obliterated, likely during periods when Templar associations became dangerous, yet not completely destroyed, as if those doing the damage were conflicted about fully erasing the memory of those buried beneath. Cross-referencing architectural, archaeological, and symbolic data created a map of Templar influence far more extensive than previously understood, concentrated strategically along Bruce's defensive perimeter and near royal strongholds crucial to his military campaigns. Modern techniques have exposed patterns invisible to earlier scholars. The systematic documentary redaction becomes apparent through paleographic analysis, showing multiple historical moments when texts were altered. The geographic distribution of evidence reveals coordinated rather than random activity. The timing of construction projects aligns precisely with the period when trained military architects should not have been available in Scotland. The revelation is not merely that Templars reached Scotland, but that their integration was systematic and sustained, representing a planned absorption of a defeated military order's assets by a kingdom that desperately needed expertise and was willing to provide protection in exchange. Yet even as evidence accumulates, institutional resistance persists. The Catholic Church, having spent centuries defending the legitimacy of the Templar suppression, remains reluctant to acknowledge evidence that the order's leaders were absolved of heresy by Pope Clement V himself, as the Chinon parchment discovered in 2001 definitively proved, yet were executed anyway for political reasons. Official church statements, when addressing inquiries about Templar survival in Scotland, emphasize that the papal dissolution was final and that claims of continuity represent romantic fiction. Church archives covering the crucial period remain partially restricted to researchers, with access requiring special permissions that are not uniformly granted. Government heritage agencies face similar tensions. Historic Environment Scotland manages sites with suspected Templar associations, balancing scholarly investigation against protecting fragile archaeological resources and managing public expectations shaped by popular theories. Excavation permits for sites that could resolve key questions have sometimes been delayed or restricted, in ways researchers find frustrating, though whether this reflects legitimate conservation concerns or institutional discomfort with potentially disruptive discoveries remains debated. Ground-penetrating radar surveys that could identify hidden structures beneath temple and other sites have faced bureaucratic obstacles. The academic community itself remains divided methodologically. Traditional medieval historians trained in documentary analysis are skeptical of theories relying heavily on archaeological and symbolic evidence while acknowledging massive documentary gaps. They invoke the principle that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we lack documents proving Templars were in Scotland after 1307 does not mean they were there. But forensic archaeologists and interdisciplinary researchers counter that absence can be evidence when it is systematic and patterned, when documents that should exist demonstrably do not, and when physical evidence contradicts documentary silence. The mystery of Bannockburn is now understood not as whether Templars participated, but as how extensive their role was, and why their participation required such comprehensive concealment. The evidence suggests they were integrated systematically into Bruce's military infrastructure over years, not merely appearing for a single battle, bringing expertise in fortification, logistics, mounted warfare, and organizational discipline that transformed Scottish capabilities. But proving this conclusively requires access to archives that remain restricted, excavation of sites where permission is denied, and acknowledgement from institutions that have spent centuries maintaining a different narrative. What can be stated with confidence is that something happened in Scotland between 1307 and 1320 involving individuals with Templar training, that physical evidence of their presence exists, despite comprehensive documentary redaction, and that this presence coincided with a dramatic improvement in Scottish military effectiveness that helped secure independence. The conspiracy was not what the Inquisitors claimed, heresy and devil worship, but something more mundane yet equally threatening to established powers: the survival of an organization that had been officially destroyed, preserved through the protection of an excommunicated king, who needed their expertise more than he feared papal disapproval. 7 centuries later, the graves at Kilmartin still bear their anonymous sword carvings. The modified fortifications at Temple still display their sophisticated architecture, and the documentary gaps still mark where truth was deliberately concealed. The mystery endures not because evidence is absent, but because acknowledging what the evidence reveals requires institutions to confront uncomfortable truths about how power, knowledge, and historical narrative have been controlled across centuries. The Phantom Knights of Bannockburn remain phantom precisely because that is how they were designed to remain, visible only to those who know how to read the language of stones and silences, carved by hands that could not sign their work, but ensured they would be remembered nonetheless.